Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is part 2 of our talk on the 1960s civil rights and the Great Society. So let's get right to this. After first you hit pause, jot down the rest of the outline, pay particular attention to those key terms. And now let's begin. So when we last left off, we were discussing civil rights under the Kennedy administration. And now both the civil rights movement domestically and the international policies of John F. Kennedy have now been brought up to speed. And we are now at November 1963. Kennedy has just been assassinated, and we have a new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So who is Lyndon Baines Johnson? Well, he's the man who takes over, sworn in on the airplane alongside Kennedy's dead body. And while the nation is in mourning, Johnson promises to continue the efforts of the new frontier of John F. Kennedy. The reality, though, his administration is a big departure from that of Kennedy's. Now, so who is Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ? Well, first of all, LBJ is a Texas Democrat, and in fact, he's the only native Texan, true Texan, depending on who you ask, to ever serve as president. Remember, George H.W. Bush was actually born in Massachusetts and went to Yale, whereas George W. Bush was born in Connecticut and went to Yale. LBJ was born in the rural areas of Texas and grew up there as well. He became a senator from the Texas Hill Country. He was very genuinely a self-made man who worked his way up the ranks and who came of age during the Great Depression. In fact, it is the Great Depression that really begins to highlight and mold LBJ to the man he will become, because he becomes enamored with the electrification projects of the CCC and the WPA, of the New Deal programs of FDR. Because one of the big programs under the New Deal was putting people to work. And one of the jobs that was done in Tennessee was called the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. But here in Texas, in the rural areas, they still did not have electricity in the towns yet. And one of these projects under the New Deal was to electrify these towns. And LBJ was recipient of one of these projects, and he became enamored with just how a larger government could benefit the people. So when he does become president, he wants to be the greatest American president ever. He wants to dwarf the New Deal. He wants to do the most good for the most people. Now, LBJ is not John Kennedy. Let me repeat. Lyndon Baines Johnson is not John Kennedy. John Kennedy was young, good-looking, eloquent, charismatic. LBJ was none of those things. He was a domineering, intimidating man who would famously give people what was called the Johnson treatment, where he would tower over them, making them feel uncomfortable and intimidating them in order to get people to do what he wanted. He was a man who craved both political power and public affection. He was crude compared to the very eloquent JFK. He was known to bring his aides into the bathroom with him, and he would begin to bark out orders to them while sitting on the toilet. Again, he's not very presidential, as you can see here, making someone feel very uncomfortable. He was not very presidential in the classic sense of, being stoic and charismatic. But in many ways, he ends up being an incredibly effective president, especially on the domestic front. And one of the reasons for this was, remember, before he became vice president, he had long been a senator. In fact, he was Senate Majority Leader. This meant he had extremely good connections with current congressmen. Remember, one of the big downfalls of JFK was his inexperience, and therefore he had very little political clout from which to push his New Frontier programs. But LBJ was different. Even though he'll push a lot of liberal progressive agenda that Southern Democrats do not like, he was a Southern Democrat. He had a number of close friends in Congress, and he knew the wheeling and dealing that needed to be done to get the votes to get his legislation passed. And the fact that he is a Southerner, unlike JFK, gives him a leg up when it comes to pushing bills through Congress. Now, Johnson, like presidents before him, people like Wilson, FDR, who pushed these progressive agendas, liberal agendas, he will eventually get bogged down by foreign affairs. But that's something we'll get to next time. For now, let's focus on the domestic policies of LBJ following the domestic policies of JFK. And so when he takes over as president in November 1963, very quickly he begins to make the presidency in his own image. In his first priority as president, he wanted a New Deal. So, 1964, very early on, he created the Council of Economic Advisors to do a study. So he took this Council of Economic Advisors and they did a study. And they figured out that 20% of the population were living below what was called the poverty line. Now, the poverty line is this standardized mark that our government uses. It says, if you live below this line, you live in poverty. Now, I want you to know it's a pretty low line. In fact, even at the present day, it's about only $12,000 per person. So a husband and wife will be right around $24,000. And if they fall below that mark, they will receive full government assistance currently in 2020. Now, back then, of course, there were no major government programs for welfare. There was unemployment insurance, yes. There was Social Security, yes. But a lot of these things that we talk about now, like Medicare, Medicaid, were not available back in 1964. And as a result, if you fell below that poverty line, you were in big, big trouble. Now, please note, though, that even today, $24,000 is not a livable wage for a husband and wife, especially if they have a couple kids. It's also the reason that kind of $12,000 per person, if you think about it, recent presidential for Democrat candidate was Andrew Yang. One of his big proposals that he purported was that you should pay everyone a wage to live, a living wage. And he proposed $1,000 a month per person, per adult, which again is that poverty line number. So that every American would have a wage that would put them right at the poverty line in America. Now, that's modern politics. Let's go back to LBJ. And so in 1964, this Committee of Economic Advisors says that 20% of Americans live below the poverty line. And so during Johnson's first State of the Union address in 1964, he got up and said, quote, "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America," unquote. Now, what does this war look like? This is not a war like boots on the ground. This is not a war you build guns for and tanks. So what does this war look like? Well, you see the answer right there on your screen. The British economist John Maynard Keynes. The idea here was to pump money into the economy. And Keynesianism was at the very heart of American liberalism, especially when it came to America's domestic policy. And LBJ would employ it to the max. LBJ called for an enormous injection of money to alleviate the economic suffering of those living in poverty. And of course, much of this would come from taxes on corporations. So under the war on poverty, we would see the passage of an Economic Opportunity Bill, which provided a Head Start program for inner city children, inner city youth, or for disadvantaged preschoolers. Something we still have today. The idea is you can't afford to go to preschool, therefore you start behind. Think about it for a minute. If you have the luxury of going to preschool, that means most likely by the time you entered kindergarten, you knew how to read, you could spell a few words probably, you might be able to write all your letters, know all your alphabet. But what if you're someone who wasn't able to afford to go to preschool? You were kept home, maybe your parents both worked, you were raised by a grandparent, and therefore when you start kindergarten, you don't even know the full alphabet yet. Who has an advantage now going forward? And often when you start ahead, you can more easily stay ahead, which gives the person who went to preschool a leg up for all their lives. So Johnson said we need to create a Head Start program for disadvantaged preschoolers. Also part of this bill was a Job Corps for inner city youth, provide jobs. Also there was what was called, work study programs for students in college. Now, many of you will be going to college in a couple years. I hope you all do. When you get there, there's often opportunity, if you need to help pay off your tuition, is to work on campus through work study programs. Started under LBJ. Also VISTA. And this was kind of a domestic Peace Corps to help clean up our streets and help alleviate some of the suffering. In 1964, on the heels of this war on poverty, Johnson called for what he called the Great Society. So whereas FDR had the New Deal, whereas Truman had the Fair Deal, whereas Kennedy had the New Frontier, the great program domestically for LBJ was the Great Society. In which case, the Great Society rested on, quote, the abundance of liberty for all. The Great Society demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are fully committed in our time. Now, under this Great Society, Johnson wanted to do three things. To use the federal government to, number one, lift poor Americans, working class, out of poverty, hence the war on poverty. Number two, vastly expand the social safety net. So he wants to expand the ideals of the New Deal. So take that foundation that FDR started and expand it. And then number three, he wants to add civil rights. So basically, if you want to sum it up in a mathematical formula, the Great Society is the New Deal liberalism plus civil rights. We finally have a president in our history whose main agenda is civil rights. Now, I want a few things here. Early in his career, LBJ was a racist. He believed in segregation. However, he had a genuine change of heart on the issue of civil rights. And it is under Johnson we will see the greatest expansion of civil rights in our nation's history. So what do I mean by this? Well, civil rights legislation first and foremost. In 1964, Johnson would push what Kennedy had started. He would push through a Civil Rights Act. And of course, one of these landmark civil rights acts that you all should know about is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I would argue that no president other than LBJ could have pushed this through Congress, a Congress dominated by Southern conservatives. Remember, Johnson had the experience, he had the clout, he had the friendships, and maybe even some dirt. He also had the experience of pushing previous civil rights legislation back in 1957 and 1960. So what did this act do? Well, it outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, such as restaurants and hotels. So all those sit-in ideas that SNCC and CORE were a part of, this was now the law of the land. So number one, outlawed discrimination in public accommodations. Number two, outlawed discrimination in employment. And to enforce this, they created the Equal the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce the idea that you cannot discriminate based on race in employment. And of course, if you ever apply for a job now, you will see that we are an EEOC, company, because every company has to abide by this, even in 2020. Now, the question though says it bans discrimination in public accommodations and in employment. Fantastic. How do you constitute discrimination? And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 labeled in names very specific categories that you could not discriminate against. And so these federally protected categories included, of course, race, religion, national origin. And those were the original three in the bill. So we had race, religion, national origin. These were the three that were promoted by President Johnson. However, there was a fourth one added to the bill later, and that was sex. Yes, sex. You are not allowed to discriminate whether someone is male or female. Now, the interesting part of this was it was not in the original bill, but rather sex was actually added by Southern conservatives. Now, let that sink in. The term sex as a federally protected category was added by Southern conservatives, who in no way, shape, or form would you think would support gender equality. And the fact was they didn't. So why did they do this? They thought it would be a poison pill to kill the bill. Remember, we talked about back in the Reconstruction era, in the passage of the 15th Amendment. Remember, women were pushing for suffrage back in the 1860s. But they were told, oh, no, just wait your turn, stop, wait. If you try to push for suffrage now, we might not be able to get it for African Americans because many Americans would not ratify the 15th Amendment, states would not, if women were included, it was thought. In the same thought, some almost 100 years later by Southern white racist conservatives, they try to do it again. They try to input the women, so sex, as a poison pill to kill the bill. And of course, it didn't kill it. Now, not for lack of a trying. Yes, sex is put in there to kill the bill. In addition, there was a filibuster led by Southern Democrats. But Johnson was able, through his connections, to cobble together enough votes to pass it. Now, one more note here before we move on, and that is one category not in there is sexual orientation. And it's still something they're trying to add to this, to rectify it nowadays and amend the 64 Civil Rights Act to add sexual orientation. But that, of course, was not included because in 1964, homosexuality was still considered a mental disease. So sure enough, he gets it passed, and you see the picture there, he's signing it. And after he signed it, an aide leaned into him and said, "Sir," quote, "this is the greatest day of your presidency," unquote. And Johnson replied, quote, "Yes, and it's the day we gave the South to the Republican Party for the rest of our lifetimes," unquote. Think about that for a minute. Johnson predicted it. The signing of the 64 Civil Rights Act turned the South from a Democratic mainstay into a Republican stronghold. If you look at almost every future election after LBJ, and you know what today, Texas is a red state. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, red states. They vote Republican. But up until 1964, they voted Democrat. Remember, Democrat was the old party of racists going back to the Civil War. They had switched, for the most part, during 1912 and again 1930s. But 1964, even though Truman had tried to add and did add civil rights to the party platform back in 48, With the signing of the Civil Rights Act, Democrats became the full commitment to civil rights and racial equality as part of the party. And by doing so, Democrats lost the South. To the present day, which still exists even now. Now think about this for a minute too. Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 64 in 1964. This is an election year. He's been president for less than a year. He signs this possibly very controversial piece of legislation in an election year. So give him credit where credit's due, because he does it. But 1964, he's up for re-election. And this election is a pivotal year in politics, this and 1968. So Johnson becomes the easy Democrat nominee. But on the Republican side, there's a search for the soul of the Republican Party. Remember, conservatives, true conservatives, had come to live in fear after the last Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember, he wasn't really a hard conservative. He was much more of a moderate. He just didn't want to see the New Deal expand, but yet he did with the Eisenhower Interstate Highway Act. And so in 1964, Republicans turned to a more radical conservative. And they turned to this man, Barry Goldwater, who back in 1960 had written a book called The Conscience of a Conservative. Now, he was a senator from Arizona, and he'd written this book, and he began to argue and stand on a few staunch ideals. Number one, he proposed the abolition of the income tax that was passed back in 1913. He wanted to overhaul Social Security, if not get rid of it completely. He opposed the Civil Rights Act, now theoretically not on racist grounds, but on the basis of it, he called it an overreach of the federal government. Remember, he wants states' rights. Fun fact, though, his opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 64 would earn him the endorsement of the KKK. Always a good endorsement to have if you're a politician. He also vigorously opposed the war on poverty, vigorously opposed the Great Society programs, vigorously opposed the New Deal state. Oh, and he wanted the wholesale bombing of Vietnam, which, to Johnson's credit, Johnson campaigned to stay out of Vietnam, which we'll get to that problem later. In other words, in short, Barry Goldwater was the far extreme right wing of the Republican Party. And he even made the mainstream Republicans feel a little uneasy. But he said, don't worry, these may be radical ideas to some people. But he said, as you see on the button, in your heart, you know he's right. And again, he makes some people feel very uncomfortable, Republicans and Democrats alike. I have a couple of videos to show you here, so pay close attention to these. These really highlight how both Republicans and Democrats viewed Barry Goldwater in 1964. But remember, he says, in your heart, you know he's right. So here's the famous Daisy ad. Now, this ad only played one time, but it is an ad that is meant to support President Johnson.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Now, this ad was so controversial, it only played one time. But the message was clear. Barry Goldwater's crazy. Do you really want to have that person who says, I want to wholesale bomb Vietnam, with his finger on the red button of a nuclear weapon? They kind of portrayed him as nuts. Now, the second one comes from a Republican themselves. So that was the Democrat view of Barry Goldwater. But how did a typical Republican view Barry Goldwater? And I think this is very illustrative not only of how Republicans thought of Barry Goldwater in 1964, but look at the parallels to today that we'll talk about for a minute afterward. This is a little bit longer video, so just sit back and enjoy.
I don't know just why they wanted to call this a confession. I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican. I've always been a Republican. My father is, his father was. The whole family is a Republican family. I voted for Dwight Eisenhower the first time I ever voted. I voted for Nixon the last time. But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man. This man scares me. Now, maybe I'm wrong. A friend of mine has said to me, listen, just because a man sounds a little irresponsible during a campaign doesn't mean he's going to act irresponsibly. You know that theory that the White House makes the man. I don't buy that. You know what I think makes a president? I mean, aside from his judgment, his experience, are the men behind him, his advisors, the cabinet. And so many men with strange ideas are working for Goldwater. You'll hear a lot about what these guys are against. They seem to be against just about everything, but what are they for? The hardest thing for me about this whole campaign is to sort out one Goldwater statement from another. A reporter will go to Senator Goldwater and he'll say, Senator, on such and such a day, you said, and I quote, blah, 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 whatever it is, end quote. And then Goldwater says, well, I wouldn't put it that way. I can't follow that. Was he serious when he did put it that way? Is he serious when he says he wouldn't put it that way? I just don't get it. A president ought to mean what he says. President Johnson, now, Johnson at least is talking about facts. He says, look, we got the tax cut bill, and because of that you get to carry home X number of dollars more every payday. We got the nuclear test ban, and because of that, there's X% less radioactivity in the food. But Goldwater, well, often you can't. I can't figure out just what Goldwater means by the things he says. I read now where he says a craven fear of death is sweeping across America. What is that supposed to mean? If he means that people don't want to fight a nuclear war, he's right. I don't. When I read some of these things that Goldwater says about total victory, I get a little worried, you know? I wish I was as sure that Goldwater is against war as I am that he's against some of these other things. I wish I could believe that he has the imagination to be able to just shut his eyes and picture what this country would look like after a nuclear war. Sometimes I wish I'd been at that convention in San Francisco. I mean, I wish I'd been a delegate. I really do, because I would have fought, you know? And I wouldn't have worried so much about party unity, because if you unite behind a man you don't believe in, it's a lie. I tell you, those people who got control of that convention, who are they? I mean, when the head of the Ku Klux Klan, when all these weird groups come out in favor of the candidate of my party, either they're not Republicans or I'm not. I've thought about just not voting in this election, just staying home, but you can't do that, because that's saying you don't care who wins, and I do care. I think my party made a bad mistake in San Francisco, and I'm going to have to vote against that mistake on the 3rd of November.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high.
So you see very quickly that even mainstream Republicans, more that center wing of Republicans that would have voted for Eisenhower, voted for Nixon in 1960 over Kennedy, they're uncomfortable with Goldwater because he's the extreme far right. Now, again, whether you support the current President Donald Trump or not, you can easily see the parallels because Donald Trump was a businessman, not a politician. And many people said, well, hey, he'll surround himself with good cabinet members. He'll become, people said, well, he don't talk very presidential during the campaign. He says a lot of things, calls people names. People said, well, the White House will change him. He'll become more presidential. He's just saying stuff to get elected. And we now know that's not the case. And again, whether you like him or don't like him, from a historical perspective, that is just not the case. You can see a number of parallels that we will continue to discuss between Barry Goldwater and Donald Trump, and we'll discuss those more in our future lectures. But for now, though, you can understand why when Barry Goldwater says, hey, in your heart, you know he's right, the Democrats reply, but in your guts, you know he's nuts. And sure enough, Johnson, apparently at least, the American people at least a little bit believed Lyndon Baines Johnson. Just a little bit. Because when the election results come in November 1964, it's a landslide. But while this is an easy victory for LBJ, notice what happened in the South. Where does Barry Goldwater win? He wins his home state of Arizona, yes. He wins the Deep South, the SEC, if you're a sports fan. Now, he didn't win Texas. Texas' term was blue. But remember, it's where LBJ's from. They voted for their native son. But the signing of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 turned the South red to Republican side of things. Nonetheless, 1964, a lot is riding on this election. Because once again, this signals that the American people embrace liberalism. 1964 is considered the high point of American liberalism. It was the sign of the Civil Rights Act. It was LBJ winning a landslide over the anti-liberalist idea, the highly conservative Barry Goldwater. And as we see going into Johnson's second term, this high point of liberalism will continue. So Johnson takes over, he's re-inaugurated in 1965, and one of the first things he has to deal with is another civil rights movement. Now, Johnson doesn't want to have to deal with civil rights, he already did that in 64, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement will force LBJ's hand. In the summer of 65, civil rights activists, the SCLC under Dr. King, SNCC, and CORE launched what they call the Freedom Summer. Their goal, to register more than 3 million African Americans to vote in the South. Now, again, they're met with violence. And so to promote and propagate this idea, this Freedom Summer, under Dr. King, these groups met in Selma, Alabama, and they began to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, more than 50 miles, a march for civil rights, for voting civil rights. And of course, they're greeted by the Alabama state troopers once again, and they will be beaten with clubs, with sticks, with dogs. And of course, you see one of the Freedom Summer participants right here, John L. Lewis, who is still a member of Congress to the present day. Now, you can't quite see it on the picture on your right, but he still carries a dent that you see on the picture on the left. He carries a dent in his skull to the present day. Now, by the time they reach to Montgomery, more than 35,000 people are marching. And King will deliver a very rousing address and speech at the state capitol building. Now, once again, LBJ does not want to pursue another piece of civil rights legislation. He wants to focus on the Great Society programs. But because of the movement and notoriety and publicity of Dr. King and the Freedom Summer movement, he reluctantly has to, again in 1965, pass civil rights legislation that will be termed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what does this act do? Well, it outlaws literacy tests. It outlaws poll taxes. It outlaws any obstacle that might stop a black voter from voting. In addition, now this is wonderful in itself, because remember, they got the right to vote, African Americans did, back in the 15th Amendment. But systematically, the South had found ways to limit and prohibit the South or Southern African Americans from voting, usually in the form of long literacy tests. Now, theoretically, these literacy tests could be given to anyone, but they were only systematically given to African Americans. And these things were sometimes 6, 7 pages long. These were not multiple choice tests. No, but they were things like, well, what is the third D of the first word in the third sequence of the fourth frame? They were tongue twister ideas trying to catch someone. And if you got one wrong answer, you can't vote. Now, some are more simple, like how many years does a senator serve? How many years, or who's your local representative? But a lot of these questions, almost no American could answer, let alone these are gotcha questions at the very heart. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 bans literacy tests, bans poll taxes. And it did a second thing too, is that if a state like Alabama, Mississippi, had a long history of discrimination when it comes to voting, the federal government, the Justice Department, would have to approve any changes to voting. So for instance, if you want to change your polling location, the Justice Department has to approve that. If you want to redraw your district lines, the Justice Department has to approve that. And this became vital because what happens is, even if African Americans could vote, if you can gerrymander your district lines, you can essentially nullify black voters. So yeah, they get to vote at the polling booths, but you basically make their votes null. So if you have a big circle downtown of African Americans who will all vote for Democrat, instead of giving that as one district, you instead take all the white zones around it and give them each an eighth of that inner city pie. Therefore, the black vote doesn't really matter. And so this is gerrymandering. And so this outlaws that and says that if a state has a history of this, of discrimination, the Justice Department will have to approve any changes, which is all well and good, except for the fact that 2 years ago, this has now been overturned. The Supreme Court said we no longer have to do this, and this part of the Voting Rights Act has been gutted to the point now where states can do whatever they please if they have a long history of discrimination. Now, this is a minor thing compared to the larger issue, but just this couple months ago, we had Super Tuesday here in Texas for the Democratic primary. And there were a number of inner city voting places where African Americans and Latinos were forced to wait up to 6 hours to vote in line, because the state of Texas has actually changed and modified and reduced the number of polling locations, making it more difficult for certain groups of people to actually place a vote. Now, this is minor, I say, because it is the primary. But what if this happens again for the president come November? If something doesn't change, you are essentially creating more opportunity for polls in more affluent, whiter neighborhoods in regions versus in the poor or Latino or African American areas. You create fewer polling opportunities, which means fewer people actually get to cast a vote. You are limiting access to voting. And in many ways, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, now, yes, there's still an issue with it today as far as being gutted a little bit. But when it was passed, and many historians will actually argue it was actually more effective as a Civil Rights Act than the Civil Rights Act of 64, because of its immediate implication. The result was, in that 1 year alone, more than 250,000 African Americans were registered by the end of that year. Now that that was out of the way, in addition to this Voting Rights Act of 65, Johnson would also flood Congress with much more New Deal legislation aimed at ending poverty, expanding health care, and of course other liberal goals. So what was the result? Well, first and foremost, Medicare and Medicaid. Now, to tell you the differences, you give care to the elderly, you provide aid for the economically disadvantaged. So Medicaid is for poor people, Medicare is for elderly. He provides $1.5 billion in federal aid to secondary and elementary education. Yay. $1 billion for anti-poverty program in Appalachia. The regions in Appalachia are some of the poorest counties in America, outside Indian reservations. 240,000 federal housing units for low-income families. $3 billion for urban renewal. Created the Department of Housing and Urban Development to help build housing, cheap, affordable housing for inner city areas. Increased automobile safety standards, cleaner air and water standards, scholarships for college-age students, and of course the Immigration Act of 1965, which is known as the Hart-Celler Act. It finally ends the discrimination quotas on immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. Let me repeat that. The Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration Act of 65, ended the discriminatory policy of national origins. It finally allows in a higher equal ceiling, not based on national origin. So it increased the actual quota ceiling, still a quota system, but it increases the ceiling number of how many people are allowed in per year. And the numbers not based on national origins, thus allowing in Eastern and Southern Europe and Asians to finally come in our country freely. On the downside, though, it did, to provide equality, add the Western Hemisphere to the quota. So it was more liberal in the sense that it got rid of the national origins, but it would impose a ceiling or a cap on Western Hemisphere nations. The scope of the Great Society legislation was bigger than anything since the New Deal. But was it a success? Honestly, it's a mixed bag. Now, many of these initiatives were aimed at improving health, nutrition, and education of poor Americans. And yes, that was effective. Head Start programs, federal aid for schools, Medicare and Medicaid, those were all successes. On the other hand, though, many of them were ill-conceived, underfunded, mismanaged. And then things like urban renewal. Now, theoretically, this was designed to help better neighborhoods in the inner city that had become poor thanks to white flight. Well, instead of using it to help the families who lived there, they instead tore down all these old neighborhoods and started trying to gentrify it instead. So again, it was not created to be racist or hurt the poorest, but the reality is it did, the way it was implemented. And so again, much some like FDR's programs, LBJ's programs, would not be intended to be racist, but they would be implemented in a way that hurt the poorest of the poor. But nonetheless, the Great Society and its landmark legislation would mark the high point of American liberalism. You also see a major expansion of civil rights under LBJ that cemented the Democratic Party as a party of civil rights. And over the next several years, white Southern Democrats would begin to abandon the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party. As we saw in the 1964 election, the South becomes red. The 1964 election, in summation, seemed to confirm the existence of the American liberal consensus. But this consensus was starting to unravel. But we'll talk about that issue next time. So for now, if you like this video, click the like button below. If you want to see more of these kind of videos, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, though, take care and bye-bye.